I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life bearable, I can bear the torture no longer. I shall cast myself from this garret window and into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we, of her crew, were treated with all the fairness and consideration due to us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken I managed to escape alone in a small boat, with water and provisions, in a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and the stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for a counted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting for either for passing ship, or the cast of shores or some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened while I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I had awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in a monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be to wonder at such a prodigious and unexpected transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and the rotten soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and the other of less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence in the barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing and nothing within sight save for the vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from the sky, which seemed to be almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled onto the stranded boat, I realized that one of the theory could only explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions with innumerable millions of years had lay hidden under the unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise a surging ocean strain my ears as I might, nor were there any seafowl prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side, to afford a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for travelling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to the overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odour of the fish was maddening, but I was too concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and to set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by the faraway hammock which rose higher than any other elevation of the rolling desert. That night I encamped. For the following day I still travelled towards the hammock, though the object seemed scarcely near when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attended the base of the mount, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. In an intervening valley setting out to the sharper relief from the general surface, too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night. but ere in the waning and fantastically gibberish moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said of the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain and the source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained to the summit of the mound and looked down at the other side into the immeasurable pit of canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim of the fathoms of chaos in the eternal night. Though my terror ran across reminiscences of Paradise Lost and Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher into the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop a few hundred feet, declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyse, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps which no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by the vast, singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of the distinct impression that its contour and position were no longer altogether work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations that I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in the abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that the far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping at my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed at the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything that I'd ever seen in books, considering most part for the conventionalised aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things that are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed in the ocean risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on the account of the enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subject could have excited the envy of the Doré. I think these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men. Though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes into waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. On their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline despite the webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiselled badly into the proportion of their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale represented by a little larger than himself. I remark, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestors of the Dagon or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood amusing whilst the moon cast queer reflections upon the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it, with only a slight, churning of its mark to rise the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters, vast, polymorphous-like, and loathsome. It darted like some stupendous monster of nightmares into the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic, scaly arms. And while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measurable sounds, I think I went mad then. My frantic ascent to the sloping cliff, my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard the peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in San Francisco Hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in the mid of the ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. For any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon the thing which I knew that they would not believe. Once I sought out and celebrated an ethnologist and amused him with the peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. Soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug was only given transient surcease. It has drawn me into the clutches of its hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written my full account on the information or the contemptuousness amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This, I ask myself, but ever does it come before me hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may, at this very moment, be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likeness on the submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows and drag down their reckoning talons the remnants of a puny, war-exhausted mankind. For a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, for some immense, slippery body slumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window. The window.